Hollywood once loved endings that left audiences shaken. But when the production code stormed in during 1934, it slammed the door on many of the darkest conclusions the screen had ever dared. Characters who once thrived in sin suddenly had to repent. Lovers who defied tradition were rewritten into cautionary tales. So, which pre-code endings were just too dark for the censors to stomach? Let's peel back the curtain on the first 5. Babyface, 1933. Few films defined the pre-code era like Babyface. From its opening minutes, this wasn't just another melodrama, it was an unapologetic showcase of ambition, survival, and desire for power in a world stacked against women. Barbara Stanwyck plays Lily Powers, a steel mill worker's daughter who learns early that men use women as currency. But instead of accepting her fate, she flips the script and starts using them right back. With every floor she climbs in a skyscraper, she leaves behind another man discarded like yesterday's suit. And here's the kicker. In the original version, Lily doesn't repent, doesn't apologize, doesn't lose. She walks away on top. The story was one of the few in early Hollywood that dared to show a woman not punished for her independence or her cunning. That's exactly why the censors hated it. To them, it wasn't just immoral, it was dangerous. Imagine an audience of Depression-era women watching this and thinking, wait, maybe I don't have to play by the rules either. Warner Brothers scrambled to appease the code office. They reshot the ending, so Lily gave up her fortune and power to settle into married life, a tamed and softened version that fit the new moral playbook. For decades, that was the only ending audiences knew. It wasn't until 2004, when the uncensored print was rediscovered, that viewers got to see the real Lily Powers in action. And suddenly, Babyface wasn't just a curiosity, it was a revelation. Here was proof that pre-code Hollywood had been far more daring, modern, and unafraid than the decades that followed. The code may have clipped Lily's wings, but Stanwyck's original ending still soars as one of the boldest statements ever buried by censorship. Scarface, 1932. Gangsters had strutted across screens before, but Howard Hawks' Scarface turned the volume up so loud that censors nearly lost their minds. Paul Mooney's Tony Camonte isn't just another hood, he's a swaggering, cocky outlaw who revels in his rise to power. Hawks shot the film with a relentless energy, machine gun chatter, flashy cars, and the now iconic neon sign blaring "The world is yours." It was intoxicating cinema, and audiences ate it up. But the ending? That's where the trouble began. In Hawks's cut, Tony dies in a hail of bullets, sprawled in the gutter like a modern Caesar. The screen fades on chaos, not order. And to the censors, that was intolerable. They argued that Tony's end, even though violent, was too romantic, too thrilling. If crime looked exciting on screen, they feared it would breed copycats. So what happened? The studio was forced to prepare multiple alternate endings. In one version, Tony is arrested, tried, and executed by the state. In another, he whimpers in an alley, stripped of dignity. Neither had the punch of Hawks' intended finale. Hughes, the producer, fought tooth and nail, sneaking the gutter death ending into certain prints. But once the code locked down in 1934, the state execution version became the standard. For years, audiences never saw the raw, chaotic death scene. Only later restorations revealed how uncompromising the original was. And looking back, it's clear why the censors panicked. Hawks didn't just make a gangster picture, he made an argument that chaos could be thrilling, even exhilarating. That terrified the morality gatekeepers more than any Tommy gun ever could. Red-Headed Woman, 1932. If Barbara Stanwyck's Lily was dangerous, Jean Harlow's, Lil Andrews in Red-Headed Woman was pure dynamite. From her first entrance, Harlow radiates a wild energy that lets you know this isn't a woman playing by society's rules. Lil is a secretary with her eye on the boss, and once she's inside his mansion, she has no intention of leaving. She seduces, manipulates, and bulldozes her way into luxury. The ending, though, became the real battlefield. In the original cut, Lil doesn't pay for her ambition. She keeps winning, climbing higher with no apology. That terrified the code reviewers. A woman who sins and walks away unpunished? Absolutely unacceptable. MGM scrambled for a fix. Their solution was to tack on a cheeky Paris epilogue, where Lil is now the mistress of a wealthy marquis, riding in cars and laughing with a younger chauffeur. It was meant to be funny, a wink that undercut her power with comedy. But here's the twist. It didn't. Audiences saw right through it. Lil wasn't punished, she was upgraded. she had gone international. The supposed moral compromise became one of the boldest mic drops in pre-code cinema. Instead of shame, the finale celebrated her unstoppable rise. Critics gasped, audiences roared, and the film became a smash. MGM had tricked the censors by disguising victory as a joke, and Harlow's performance made the ending unforgettable. Today, Red-Headed Woman stands as proof that sometimes censorship backfires. The studio tried to cage the character, but Harlow's Lil just kept climbing, her laugh echoing long after the credits rolled. Freaks 1932. Todd Browning's Freaks remains one of the most infamous films ever released by a major Hollywood studio. Set in a traveling circus, it stars real sideshow performers people rarely seen on screen except as objects of ridicule. But here, Browning gave them dignity, community, and, in the finale, power. The original ending was devastating. When the trapeze artist Cleopatra and her strongman lover plot to exploit and betray one of the performers, the Freaks, band together during a thunderstorm. The imagery is unforgettable. Knife-wielding performers crawling through mud, rain pouring, their faces lit by lightning as they close in. Cleopatra is dragged into the night, and in the original cut, the result was gruesome, unflinching, and shocking. Audiences at preview screenings reportedly screamed, fainted, and fled theaters. MGM panicked, hacking nearly 30 minutes from the film. They softened the climax, blurred the most disturbing images, and then stapled on a sweet epilogue where Hans, the dwarf who had been betrayed, reunites with his kind-hearted former fiancée Frida. The attempt was to add comfort, to remind audiences of humanity after horror. But even in its cut form, Freaks was banned in Britain for decades, dismissed in the US, and effectively buried. The censors had taken away the film's full punch, but the remnants still carried an atmosphere of dread that no studio gloss could erase. Today, the surviving version has become a cult classic, celebrated for its raw humanity and daring. The missing ending lives on as legend, a finale so dark, so unflinching, that MGM itself tried to erase it from existence. Ann Vickers, 1933. Not every pre-code controversy came from gangsters or horror. Sometimes, it was a simple story about a woman daring to control her own life. Ann Vickers, adapted from Sinclair Lewis's novel, starred Irene Dunne as a social reformer who takes charge of her destiny in ways that unsettled the moral watchdogs. The novel was radical, tackling issues like prison reform, personal independence, and relationships outside convention. Early drafts of the film carried that same spirit, giving Anne an ending where she doesn't bend to society's rules. Instead, she stays committed to her ideals, even when they put her at odds with tradition. The Code Office, though, slammed on the brakes. Joseph Breen and his team demanded the ending be rewritten to deliver. A clear distinction between right and wrong. In other words, Anne couldn't simply live on her own terms. The film's conclusion was reshaped so that she pays for her choices, softens her independence, and fits into a more socially acceptable mold. Critics at the time noticed how clunky the third act felt. What had been a daring portrait of a modern woman suddenly turned into a bland morality tale. Reviewers wrote that the film had been robbed of its fire, and they were right. What's striking today is how threatening independence was to the Code Office. Anne wasn't a criminal, wasn't violent, wasn't corrupt. She was just a woman refusing to be boxed in. That, more than anything, showed how deeply the censors feared stories that didn't reinforce their version of order. Ann Vickers became a case study in how the code didn't just tame Hollywood's darkness, it tamed its progress. Hold Your Man, 1933. Jean Harlow and Clark Gable, two of the hottest stars of the era, teamed up for Hold Your Man, a film that starts like a fizzy romance but dives headfirst into murkier waters. Harlow's Ruby is a tough cookie, a woman who knows how to play men, while Gable's Eddie is a con man always working an angle. Together, they're electric. But when one of Eddie's schemes spirals into tragedy, Ruby is sent to a reformatory. Now here's where things got messy. In early drafts, Ruby was going to remain defiant, unbroken, even by prison. That ending would have left her as a woman scarred but still in charge of her destiny. The code enforcers wouldn't have it. To them, a bad girl had to repent. So the final act was overhauled. Ruby is humbled by her time behind bars, reformed by punishment, and finally, rewarded with marriage to Eddie. The change was glaring. Audiences could feel the gears grinding as Ruby transformed from a sharp-witted survivor into a docile bride. The movie, once daring, was shoved into the standard code template: wrongdoing, punishment, redemption, domestic bliss. And yet, Harlow refuses to fully surrender. Even in the forced finale, her performance has a spark that says Ruby hasn't really changed. You can see the fire in her eyes, the sly smile that undercuts the pious bow the studio tried to tie around her story. That tension between what the script says and what Harlow projects is what makes Hold Your Man still fascinating. It's less about what's on the page and more about the battle between star power and censorship. And in that fight, Harlow still wins. The Story of Temple Drake, 1933. When Paramount announced they were adapting William Faulkner's Sanctuary, jaws dropped. The novel was notorious, considered one of the most shocking of its time. And Miriam Hopkins, one of Hollywood's brightest stars, was cast as Temple Drake, the privileged young woman who falls into a spiral of ruin after a single night of choices gone wrong. The original ending was grim. Faulkner's novel leaves Temple destroyed, a symbol of corruption and despair. Hopkins' version followed that trajectory. Temple's life is permanently altered, scarred in ways no redemption can fix. Preview audiences were stunned. Censors, however, were enraged. A story this bleak, they argued, was depraved and unfit. Under pressure, Paramount retooled the ending. Instead of collapse, Temple takes the witness stand, confesses the truth, and regains a sense of dignity through honesty. The film wraps with the comforting idea that justice is restored and Temple has found redemption. In other words, neat, tidy, and moral. But the rewrite undercut everything that made the story powerful. Faulkner's point was that society abandoned Temple, that the world could be cruel and indifferent. By offering courtroom redemption, the film sidestepped the real darkness. Critics at the time noticed, calling the ending unsatisfying and false. And yet, even with the softened close, the story of Temple Drake caused outrage. It was pointed to again and again as evidence of why Hollywood needed stricter regulation. Ironically, the censors who demanded the changes still held it up as a dangerous example. The film became one of the nails in the coffin of the pre-code era, sacrificed on the altar of morality. Waterloo Bridge, 1931. Directed by James Whale, yes, the same man behind Frankenstein. Waterloo Bridge is a haunting romance that ends in devastation. Mae Clarke stars as Myra, a chorus girl struggling to survive during World War I. When she meets a soldier, they fall in love, but the shadow of her life on the margins never leaves her. The ending is what made this film unforgettable. Myra, desperate and destitute, is killed during an air raid, her body lying on the bridge where she first met her lover. No redemption, no reconciliation, just a brutally realistic end for a woman caught in circumstances beyond her control. For audiences in 1931, the film was heartbreaking. For the code office, it was intolerable. A woman who had fallen was not allowed to die sympathetically. Her ending had to be moral, not tragic. When the production code began to rule Hollywood in 1934, Waterloo Bridge was deemed unreleasable in its original form. Instead of cutting it, MGM shelved it entirely and produced a sanitized remake in 1940, starring Vivien Leigh and Robert Taylor. That version turned Myra's story into a conventional romance, with none of the brutal honesty of Whale's film. For decades, Whale's original was forgotten, its raw finale hidden. But when rediscovered later, it stunned new audiences with its honesty. The tragedy wasn't exploitative, it was human, an acknowledgement that sometimes life ends unfairly. The fact that the code banned it says everything about the gulf between pre-code daring and the morality-driven years that followed. Island of Lost Souls, 1932. H.G. Wells' The Island of Dr. Moreau was already unsettling, but Paramount's Island of Lost Souls took it further, transforming the tale into one of the most disturbing pre-code horror films ever made. Charles Laughton's Dr. Moreau is both charming and terrifying, playing God by creating human-animal hybrids on his island. The climax is unforgettable. The hybrids, tired of cruelty, rise against their creator. In a scene dripping with menace, they drag Moreau into his own laboratory, surround him with scalpels and surgical tools, and give him a taste of the horror he inflicted on them. The screen fades on vengeance, not justice. That finale sent censors into a frenzy. It wasn't just the violence, it was the implication that humans could act like beasts, that morality was fragile, and that God's order could be overthrown. When the production code came into full power, Island of Lost Souls was one of the first films denied reissue. Unless the ending was trimmed into something more moral, it was considered unfit. For years, audiences couldn't see it at all. The film became infamous, whispered about as one of the lost terrors of early cinema. And when it finally resurfaced, decades later, its power hadn't dulled. The finale is still chilling, still daring, and still one of the clearest examples of how the code wasn't just about trimming content, it was about controlling ideas. Island of Lost Souls didn't just end with horror. It ended by tearing down the very concept of order, designed for living 1933. If you think censorship only came for violent films, think again. Ernst Lubitsch's Design for Living was a romantic comedy, but one so playful, so cheeky, that the code banned it outright. Miriam Hopkins stars as Gilda, a woman caught between two men, played by Frederick March and Gary Cooper. Instead of choosing, she decides to live with both, forming an unconventional trio. The ending is pure Lubitsch. In the final scene, the three are shown squeezed into a cab together, laughing, teasing, and happy. It's not sordid, it's not tragic, it's joyous. And that was exactly the problem. The code declared it immoral because it celebrated a lifestyle that didn't fit the one man, one woman, married ideal. When the code took control in 1934, Design for Living was blacklisted from reissue. No cuts could fix it because the very premise violated the rules. For decades, it was nearly impossible to see, surviving only in limited screenings until the loosening of restrictions years later. Looking at it now, the finale feels shockingly modern. Instead of punishment or shame, the film ends with laughter and freedom. It suggests that love can take different forms, and happiness doesn't need to fit a single mold. That message was light years ahead of its time, and exactly why the code worked so hard to erase it. Female 1933. Picture this: Ruth Chatterton striding through an office filled with men, barking orders, signing contracts, and running a business empire. That's Female, a pre-code Warner Brothers drama that dared to flip gender roles on their head. Chatterton's Allison Drake wasn't just successful, she was untouchable, both in business and in her private life, where she treated men as casually as male bosses treated secretaries. For 70 minutes, the film made her unstoppable. But then came the ending. In the original drafts, Allison doesn't give up power. She remains head of her empire, her independence intact. The studio screened it, and the code enforcers practically lit their hair on fire. A woman in charge who doesn't pay a price? No way. They demanded a new conclusion. So Warner Bros. Bolted on a sudden, whiplash-inducing finale. Out of nowhere, Allison decides her boardroom life is empty and chooses marriage instead. She hands over control to her new husband, steps out of the spotlight, and embraces domestic life. The transition feels forced, almost absurd, after everything that came before. But here's the catch. Chatterton's performance refuses to bend. Even in the contrived final minutes, you can see in her eyes that Allison isn't convinced by her own words. Audiences then, and viewers now, can sense the defiance simmering beneath the surface. The forced ending doesn't erase her dominance, it just highlights how scared the censors were of her power. Female stands today as one of the clearest examples of how the code didn't just control plots, it controlled the image of women Hollywood could show. Ex-Lady 1933. Bette Davis was just beginning her rise to stardom when she took on Ex-Lady. The film was meant to showcase her as a modern woman for a modern era. Davis plays Helen, a successful graphic artist who openly rejects marriage. She wants love, sure, but not the contract, not the expectations, and definitely not the cage of convention. For much of the film, she holds her ground with sharp wit and unapologetic honesty. The ending was supposed to be revolutionary. Helen would keep her independence, proving that happiness didn't have to end at the altar. But the code office had other plans. They saw the script, clutched their pearls, and demanded the finale be rewritten. The film's resolution was retooled, so Helen reconciles with her lover and embraces marriage after all. Independence gone, individuality softened, conformity restored. Audiences at the time noticed the tonal clash. Reviews complained that the ending felt like a cheat, as though the film had lost its nerve in the final reel. They weren't wrong, the film had been hijacked by censorship before it even hit theaters. For Davis, Ex-Lady was a career stepping stone, but she later dismissed it as forgettable. Ironically, it's the very tampering that makes it fascinating now. You can see the tension between the story's progressive spirit and the studio's forced compromise. The ending tells us Helen surrendered, but Davis's sly expressions suggest otherwise. And that silent rebellion, visible even in a compromised film, is exactly what gave Davis the edge to become one of the most fearless stars of her generation. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, 1931. Frederick March's turn in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde remains one of the most iconic performances of classic horror. His transformation scenes, achieved through innovative makeup and camera tricks, stunned audiences in 1931. But it wasn't just the effects that left jaws on the floor, it was the ending. In the original cut, Hyde's downfall is grim and uncompromising. The narrative builds to a conclusion where his violent impulses consume him, and his death plays as both grotesque and tragic. It's messy, unsettling, and powerful. And that was the problem. When the production code began full enforcement, the PCA demanded the film be trimmed before it could ever be reissued. The final reels were heavily cut, dulling the raw impact of Hyde's end. Scenes of psychological torment were shortened, the horror softened, and Jekyll's collapse reframed into something more orderly. Instead of a harrowing spiral, audiences got a sanitized morality tale. For decades, only this safe version circulated. When restorations in later years unearthed the original footage, the difference was night and day. The uncensored ending wasn't just scarier, it was more daring. It suggested that inside everyone lurks darkness that can't be neatly boxed up. That's exactly why the code hacked it to pieces. March won the Academy Award for Best Actor for his performance, but even his brilliance couldn't protect the film from censorship. What makes Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde stand out today is that its lost ending reminds us of how far the code went, not just cutting content, but cutting the soul out of a film. Blonde Venus, 1932. Marlene Dietrich was never meant to play by rules, and Blonde Venus proved it. She stars as Helen, a woman who leaves her husband and becomes a nightclub performer, caught between domestic life and personal freedom. The film revels in her magnetic presence, her glamour, her defiance. For most of the runtime, Helen is unapologetically independent, a woman who makes choices for herself rather than for others. And then came the ending. In the original conception, Helen's life closes in ambiguity. She doesn't return to her husband, doesn't repent, she simply continues on. Her independence intact, but her future uncertain. It was messy, real, and radical. The code, however, would not allow it. Paramount was forced to rewrite the final scenes so Helen reconciles with her husband and child, closing the story with domestic order. The new ending didn't match the film's tone at all. It was a tidy bow slapped on a story that had thrived on complexity. Critics at the time noted how false it felt, and even audiences could sense the disconnect. Dietrich's performance never lets you believe her character is truly tamed. Even in the softened finale, her eyes suggest a woman who is still larger than the cage she's been shoved into. That's what makes Blonde Venus endure. The censors thought they'd erased her independence, but Dietrich's presence is too powerful. She radiates rebellion, turning the forced ending into a quiet protest. It's less a surrender than a sly wink to the audience, daring them to believe she'll ever really stay put. So, there you have it. 14 pre-code endings that Hollywood tried to erase, soften, or smother under the weight of the production code. But here's the twist. In cutting away the darkness, the studios only proved how daring those endings really were. Which of these do you think should have been left untouched? Drop your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more dives into cinema's forbidden history.